Should you get the Cooler Master i70C over your stock cooler? It costs less than a meal, but is it worth the money? Well, are you looking for an upgrade over the Intel stock cooler but don't want to break the bank? Or maybe your stock cooler just broke down in a freak accident and you're just looking for a simple replacement on the cheap? Well, if your answer is yes, keep watching. By the way, we are trying out a new format today, so let us know what you think in the comments below. I'm Vincent Chan from Podder.net and let's check out the Cooler Master i70C. The Cooler Master i70C is specifically designed to be compatible with the LGA 1105X socket CPUs. That also includes the LGA 1200 socket, as they do share the same cooler mounting holes. As you might have already noticed, it's really compact and it will fit into most AIO systems or other small form factor designs. One of the main highlights is that we have a 120mm fan with blue LEDs and it touts a rifle bearing with a life expectancy of 280,000 hours. Or nearly 32 years of non-stop operation. Yeah. Aside from the large-ish fan, the overall design of the Cooler Master i70C is pretty much what you expect from a stock cooler with aluminium attached to a copper core. We don't really expect too much out of the Cooler Master i70C. It's definitely not gonna blow your mind with its cooling capabilities, but we'll be testing it to see whether it meets 3 of our main criteria for a good cooler. First is ease of installation, second is how loud will it go, and of course how well it will cool. We will be testing this against the Intel stock coolers, which has retained most of its design elements since the LGA 775 Core 2 Duo era, except that it is actually smaller now and probably cheaper to produce. We have the Intel stock cooler here and it is apparently made by Foxconn for Intel. It has a 92mm fan with hydraulic bearings which are pretty box standard. The design of the heatsink itself is very similar to the Cooler Master i70C with a copper core and aluminium fins, although you might notice that the fins extend out of the center in a radial pattern instead of the straight fins that Cooler Master went with. There's also noticeably less mass as the heatsink is actually a lot thinner than it was in the past. Now, next up we have the newer version of the Intel stock cooler. This sexy black thing is bundled with the 10th gen Core i7, Core i9 and Xeon processors, so it might be actually a bit better at cooling. Specs wise, it is very similar to the Intel stock cooler we just saw earlier. There's a 92mm fan with a hydraulic bearing rated at 22 decibels for noise, and the heatsink is also similar with aluminium fins and a copper core. But as you might have noticed, the main difference is that the fins are black here and the cables are also sleeved, making for a much better looking cooler. And oh, this is apparently made by Delta instead of Foxconn. Aside from the minor differences that we mentioned earlier, there isn't much differentiating the two coolers. And now let's get started on our first section, installation. Starting off with the Cooler Master i70C, we can see that it is quite simple to install. If you have any trouble, you can refer to the manual or just watch our installation guide video which we have linked below. We would prefer you do the latter. Thanks! The gist of it is pretty basic. You have to install a backplate and screw the cooler in. While it ranks as one of the easiest installations among the coolers we have worked with, it still needed a bit of effort. I think it might be due to Cooler Master going with a design that's pretty similar to the Rave Stealth, but the problem is that Intel motherboards do not come with a backplate pre-installed, unlike AMD motherboards. Now, on the other hand, we have the Intel stock cooler. It is as basic as it gets. Grab the cooler, whip on some thermal paste and push down the push pins. Then all you have to do is plug in the fan connector and we are open for business. If your cooler is new, you can even skip the thermal paste step as there is some pre-applied to the coolers, so making the installation process even simpler. Let's say if the Intel cooler is a 5-minute job, the i70C is probably a little bit more troublesome, so I would say it would be a 10-minute job tops. We've installed more than our fair share of coolers, and I must say that the Cooler Master i70C is among the easiest we have tried. But nothing beats the gold standard of Intel stock coolers, especially not AMD's stock Rift Prism coolers. But I digress. So, clearly enough, the Intel stock coolers win this round. For the next part, we have the noise test. So, we are measuring it with our phone with it placed about 30cm or 1 foot away from the closed Cooler Master Q300L. This is not the most insulated case, and 30cm from the case is nearer than most people will sit to their PC cases, so if the cooler we are testing is noisy, you will hear it. We used MSI Dragon Center to push the fan from 25% at its lowest to 50%, 75%, and 100% to measure the noise at every setting. First up, the old silver Intel stock cooler's results. We have the fan doing about 34.8 decibels at 25%, 36.3 decibels at 50%, and 75% pushes the noise level up to 35.9 decibels, while 100% fan speed marginally increases the noise level to 36 decibels. So not exactly a noisy cooler, which is surprising considering our experience with Intel stock coolers in the past. We then take a look at the black Intel stock cooler. It is just ever so slightly louder at just about every setting, with it being 39 decibels on average at its loudest fan speed. Still, I would say that this is a respectable result if noise is a major concern to you. Next up, the Cooler Master i70C. At 25%, it puts out 36.6 decibels of noise, and moving up to 50% fan speed apparently doesn't change anything. At its loudest, the average is at 38.1 decibels, which is marginally quieter than the black Intel stock cooler. With that, I guess we can crown the old silver Intel stock cooler as the victor in the noise test. See, Intel stock coolers aren't all that bad. And we now move on to the most important aspect of a cooler, its cooling performance. A cooler has no point if it can't do its job of cooling. So as we know, the Masterbox Q300L here is far from the best case for airflow. So to prevent the case from being the bottleneck, we are testing with the case open. We will be showing you guys the results with two 80mm fans in the case as exhaust to expedite the removal of heat from the case. The CPU used is an Intel Core i5-10600K running at stock settings. It's worth mentioning that this is a 125W TDP CPU, so not exactly the kind of CPU that you or Intel expects to be cooled by such dainty little coolers. So right off the bat, we see the old silver Intel cooler hitting 100°C really early on. And the average clocks are also quite abysmal at 3.4 GHz. The highest we saw was 3.7 GHz and the lowest was 3.1 GHz. Average power draw throughout the test was an abysmal 49 watts, so it's definitely throttling very hard here. Moving on to the black Intel stock cooler, a similarly hot scenario is in here. The CPU maxes out at 3.7 GHz and averages 3.2 GHz with the lowest frequency observed at 3 GHz. That's even lower than the silver Intel stock cooler. The average power draw is even lower at just 44 watts, so it is throttling even harder here. Now, onto the Cooler Master i70C. We still see it hit 100°C, but there's a lot more to the story than just the temperature. The average power draw is now much higher at 93 watts, and thus the clocks are also higher, averaging 4.25 GHz. The 4.5 GHz peak and 4.0 GHz minimum clocks are clearly much higher than what we saw with the two Intel stock coolers as well. We also tested it with a different airflow configuration, with one intake fan and one exhaust fan. The temperatures observed were still uncomfortably high, but the average power draw has now dropped a bit to 90 watts. Average clocks are also a little bit lower at 4.22 GHz, which does make some sense. In an open case, intake fans don't really help out, and having two exhaust fans will help to remove the hot air from around the CPU cooler faster before it gets recirculated through the heatsink again. It is worth mentioning that the Intel Core i5-10600K doesn't come with a stock cooler, and I guess we now know just exactly why. Even the Cooler Master i70C, while performing significantly better, still resulted in some throttling. But it did so while handling a power draw of above 90 watts, which means that if you use it with a non-unlocked Intel CPU, which are usually rated for 65W TDP, you would be perfectly fine with the Cooler Master i70C. Without any doubt, the Cooler Master i70C is the best performing cooler out of the trio here when it comes to actual cooling capability. We now actually know quite a bit more about the Intel stock coolers than we have actually planned to. Both the silver and black ones are really easy to install with the push pin mechanism, but they're definitely not the same in the other aspects. We found that the older silver version is really quiet and is also really weak when it comes to cooling performance. But it isn't the worst one here. The worst one is the black Intel stock cooler. It not only runs louder than the old silver Intel stock cooler, it is also the worst performing one. While it is louder, it is still rather quiet in the overall scheme of things, but when comparing against the other two, it is very inefficient when you consider its cooling performance or lack thereof here. It cost our Core i5-10600K to throttle the most, and its only saving grace is that it looks good. And then we have the star of the day, the Cooler Master i70C. It's not the easiest to install, and it is slightly louder than the old silver Intel stock cooler. But it definitely outshines both of them when it comes to cooling performance. We are seeing power draws that are more than 2 times higher than what the Intel stock coolers can handle, and thus the CPU could hit much higher clocks with the i70C. Overall, we would give the Cooler Master i70C the win here, as cooling is definitely the most important aspect of a cooler. Silence is great, ease of installation is nice to have, but a cooler is meant to cool, and that's what the Cooler Master i70C delivers. And I guess that's it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed our review of the Cooler Master i70C, and also somehow we ended up reviewing the Intel stock coolers as well. If you guys did enjoy this video, make sure to give us a thumbs up. If you didn't, still, give us a thumbs up and let us know why you didn't enjoy this video in the comments below. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification button, and also don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook for more content like this. I'm Mr. Chan from Podder.net, and I will see you guys in the next video. 再见!